Welcome. I'm Lee Cowan, and this is Here Comes the Sun, a closer look at some of the people, places, and things we bring you every weekend on Sunday morning. Researcher Arline Geronimus created a stir in the medical community when she said stress from injustices like racism can in fact lead to poor health. She dubbed the long-term effects of that stress on the body weathering. It's also the title of her recent book. She spoke about her research to our own Nancy Giles.
This is not something that just affects people of color, weathering. I think that's an important point that you make. It can be a class issue as well. There's a lot of different factors.
It can be a class issue. It can be a stigmatized group issue. Anybody who's human is capable of becoming weathered and will become weathered to some degree if they're also oppressed or marginalized or suffering endless stressors, whether it's environmental or material hardships or hunger, or whether it's the fact that you're not affirmed or valued and you have to question where you belong and what it's safe to do or say in different situations.
Later in the show, an exclusive excerpt from Nancy Giles' chat with Arline Geronimus.
Why do you think people are understanding it better now?
I think there are a few reasons. We have much more evidence. The way I dealt with things 30 years ago is I didn't do a lot of public speaking, but I kept doing the research.
Good.
And teaching it in my classes, and some of my students, as you've seen, went out and did research, and other people were also doing research. The Human Genome Program happened, and that pretty much, debunked any belief that there are race genes.
Then at one distillery in Naples, New York that is, maple syrup isn't just for the pancakes. Hollerhorn Distilling turns the syrup, tapped just a few miles away, into spirits. Luke Burbank takes a sip.
Neubauer combines locally produced maple syrup with water and yeast, then distills that fermented mixture, transforming the golden nectar back into a clear liquor.
And that's the spirit that we're pulling off.
The color comes from the barrel aging process. The labels are drawn and designed by his wife, Melissa.
It's maple syrup, yeast, and water.
Oh, it's very, very smooth. It's really different than anything I've ever tasted.
That's all coming up right here on Here Comes the Sun. Researcher Arline Geronimus first identified weathering, her name for the effects of injustices on our health, over 30 years ago. She withdrew, though, from the spotlight after her work was heavily criticized. But today, it's more widely received. She sat down with our Nancy Giles to discuss those findings.
It happens hundreds of times a day in this country. The birth of a child to a child.
40 years ago, the public was outraged. It seemed there was a wave of teenage girls, particularly black teenage girls, getting pregnant.
How old are you?
14.
How old is your baby?
My baby is 4 months.
So this was a new idea, this new deviant class of people, and it was portrayed in these terms that were really not accurate.
Babies having babies.
Babies having babies.
Yeah, broken homes,
Right,
Yeah.
the whole thing, and none of that applied.
Arline Geronimus was at the time a graduate student. The prevailing wisdom was that high rates of infant mortality in the black community were because women were having children when they were too young.
I had worked in a school for pregnant teens, and none of what I was hearing and had taken as common sense myself was what I was seeing.
Geronimus looked at the numbers and found that, actually, younger mothers were having more successful pregnancies.
For the black women, the lowest risk ages were in the teens, in the late teens, and then they went straight up, so that by the 20s and certainly by the mid to late 20s, there was substantially more risk of infant mortality if you had a baby compared to if you were 18 or 19. And by 35, things were off the charts.
How did people react to what you found?
Not very well.
Yeah, I can imagine.
People thought I was promoting teen childbearing. The papers wrote columns where they called it things like "Research Queen says let them have babies." I got death threats.
Geronimus became a professor in the School of Public Health at the University of Michigan, where she teaches to this day. She lowered her profile, but also widened her perspective, examining indicators like the lower life expectancy of Black Americans compared to white Americans. She developed a theory that stress caused by racism and other societal pressures contributes to poor health. She named it weathering.
The idea of weathering was connoting sort of how a rock, for example, would be weathered by hundreds of years of rain and wind.
Of course, it's going to affect it.
It's going to affect it.
And wear it down.
Absolutely wear it down. I like the word weathering in particular because it also has another meaning, which is that you weather the storm.
The weathering theory deals with not just length of life, but quality of life. For example, while on average Black women outlive white men, Geronimus found that Black women faced shorter active life expectancies than white men. That is, Black women become disabled at earlier ages. After decades of working on the theory, she's now pulled it all together in a book called, of course, Weathering.
Weathering is the way that racism, structural racism, makes life very hard.
This is not something that just affects people of color, weathering. I think that's an important point that you make. It can be a class issue as well. There's a lot of different factors.
It can be a class issue. It can be a stigmatized group issue. Anybody who's human is capable of becoming weathered and will become weathered to some degree if they're also oppressed or marginalized or suffering endless stressors, whether it's environmental or material hardships or hunger, or whether it's the fact that you're not affirmed or valued and you have to question where you belong and what it's safe to do or say in different situations.
She endured a lot for this work, and we just have to applaud her. Her courage is remarkable.
Dr. Kimberly Dawn Wisdom has spent much of her career putting Geronimus's theories into practice, trying to overcome the impacts of weathering. Dr. Wisdom is the Senior Vice President of Community Health and Equity at Henry Ford Health in Detroit. She was Michigan's first Surgeon General.
The body keeps score.
Day-to-day stress actually changes the body, down to the cellular level, leading to premature aging.
So take diabetes, take hypertension, take cardiovascular disease, infant mortality, maternal mortality. Just multiply the poor outcome by 2 or by 3, and that's what you see in populations of color. So it's like the Caucasian population can catch a cold, but populations of color actually develop pneumonia.
So, for example, the latest studies show infant mortality rates for Black Americans that are more than double those of white Americans. To take on the challenge, Dr. Wisdom founded the WIN Network, which stands for the Women Inspired Neighborhood Network. Expectant mothers are given health care, guidance, and support through pregnancy and beyond, which has led to maternal and infant deaths falling and birth weights rising. Mothers like Courtney Anderson and her third child, Kalani.
8 months. And what was her experience like having her through WIN?
Great. She's a happy baby, the most happiest baby I got.
Wow.
Anderson had her first child, Camreen, before she was in the WIN Network. He was followed a year later by his brother, Christian.
Well, my first child, I was had my hands full, kind of stressed, kind of bummed out, postpartum depression. But by them talking to me and giving people to talk to me and stuff like that, if they're not there for me and stuff, I'm actually interacting more with my kids. I'm more happy with my kids. I get to talk to my kids and be like, hey, woo, type stuff.
And then how do you think that's going to affect your kids?
It's going to affect them really well, and to know that their mom is happy when mom is happy. They have a lot more.
What would you say to people who would kind of maybe blow this off and say everybody has stress, everybody has things to deal with, what's the big deal? Take care of it yourself. Be responsible for your own health.
Right. Yes, people should eat healthy, have healthy behaviors, but yet we see the weathering when we look through the lens of what's really happening in a society. You can do all those things and have a poor outcome. See, the typical narrative is you eat healthy, you go to school, you get a college degree, you have a good life,
right,
and you live to 80 or 90.
Right.
That happens with one population. When you find another population that eats healthy, goes to college, gets an education, gets her PhD, and dies in maternal mortality. So
Something's wrong
Something
there.
is wrong.
So for some people who might feel like the idea of weathering it could be seen as another way of, let's just say, making Black people into victims, than not going past that might see that as building in another stereotype.
That couldn't be farther from the truth. Even if you go back to slavery, no one was working harder or doing more. But the people who pronounce on Black people's poverty as self-inflicted because they're too lazy or too irresponsible, they're just wrong.
At the end of the day, it got me thinking about my own family. My parents died in their 70s. 2 siblings died in their early 60s. All of them much too soon.
So much diabetes runs in my family. Unfortunately, cancer, high blood pressure. There were certain ailments that were kind of, I don't know how else to describe it, but sort of expected almost, or that's just kind of comes with the territory. And this says it shouldn't come with the territory.
It shouldn't.
Or the reason it came with the territory was that kind of weathering, that constant.
Absolutely. You've described it exactly. What many people of color families say that, oh, we all get diabetes. We all get cancer. That's part of the natural course of life. That's the life course. That is not the life course.
Up next, an exclusive excerpt from Nancy Giles' chat with Arline Geronimus. Something you can only see right here on Here Comes the Sun. Stay with us. As promised, here's more from Nancy Giles' interview with Arline Geronimus.
Can you break down weathering and like the different sources that can weather a person?
Some of the causes of weathering, which I sort of call the neon lights of weathering, and no one would be surprised,
Right.
are things like toxic environments, hunger, being exposed to too much heat or too much cold, the stress of working in a job that's toxic itself, or even just requires you to stand all day or do heavy physical labor, the kinds of jobs that we usually associate with the working class. Though the parts psychosocially that have to do with just how to figure out how to make ends meet if you're living paycheck to paycheck. So those are the kinds of things that I'm calling the neon lights. I also talk about in the book, I call it age-washed. We're led to believe that the relationship between age and health for any of us and for all sorts of health conditions is greater risk in childhood, and then you reach some sort of, you get past adolescence and you reach sort of the prime,
right,
this plateau, you know, in your mid-20s, say, going till your 60s, and then things may start
to fall apart
again. And, you know, we've all, to some extent, had this experience, who've made it to that age. But in any case, and we think that's driven by sort of a universal developmental process. So if you're not experiencing that, then the thought is you either were just unlucky in your genes, or you had a horrible accident, or you're engaging in bad behavior. Whether that bad behavior is just not eating right and not exercising, or whether that bad behavior is taking drugs or being an alcoholic, there's just a sense that if you could just take personal responsibility, you would have that universal prime of life in your 20s, 30s, 40s, and even 50s.
And your studies said that's not true.
It's not true. It's not true. While, of course, there are developmental aspects to aging, there are also the structural impacts on your health, which is what weathering's all about. And so the context in which you grow up, the exposures that are not good for your health to which you're exposed, the amount of them, the chronicity of them, kind of supersede what's ever happening developmentally.
Looking back, now, when you realize now where we are now and how your work has a new resonance, what's that been like for you?
It's been a very profound and mixed experience. Obviously, it's better to be respected and to be taken seriously than to be given death threats. So,
Why do you think people are understanding it better now?
I think there are a few reasons. We have much more evidence. The way I dealt with things 30 years ago is I didn't do a lot of public speaking, but I kept doing the research.
Good.
And teaching it in my classes, and some of my students, as you've seen, went out and did research, and other people were also doing research. The Human Genome Program happened, and that pretty much, debunked any belief that there are race genes, which was one of the explanations people sometimes fell back on. The story is clearly much stronger now. I think the other reason people have been willing to take it a little more seriously is because they've seen all the things that have happened to Black Americans. Not that they weren't happening before the last 10 years, but they've all been very public. And so it's hard to just erase that those things happen in this country.
Up next, tapping into a new kind of spirit. Welcome back. Hollerhorn Distilling, located in the Finger Lakes region of New York, is known for turning maple syrup into spirits. Although owner Carl Neubauer's creation is made out of just water and locally produced maple syrup and a little bit of yeast, it's a pretty intensive process and requires labor and a lot of love. Here's Luke Burbank.
And there begins the old ritual of the New England spring. It's maple sugaring time again.
Most of us are familiar with the northeastern tradition of taking maple sap and turning it into syrup, a process once documented right here on CBS by our own Charles Kuralt.
Smells good. This annual harvest is all the sweeter for being a gift from the trees.
It takes 40 gallons of sap to get just 1 gallon's worth of maple syrup.
It's really wonderful. Good.
But that was then, and this is now. At Steve Finnan's 12-Mile Creek Maple Farm in Naples, New York, in New York's Finger Lakes region.
We verified that it's nice and clear, and now we're putting it in barrels.
The machinery is modern, and the final product?
Cheers.
Cheers.
Probably not what you were expecting.
Oh, that's so good.
It's 40% alcohol.
This used to be sap in a tree.
This was sap in a tree.
That's right. This is not your granddad's maple syrup. This is Carl Neubauer's tree spirits that he makes at Hollerhorn Distilling, not far from the maple farm.
There have been times that are like pure magic where everything aligns and they're into a beautiful long run of some amazing high quality syrup that tastes phenomenal.
Neubauer combines locally produced maple syrup with water and yeast, then distills that fermented mixture, transforming the golden nectar back into a clear liquor.
And that's the spirit that we're pulling off.
The color comes from the barrel aging process. The labels are drawn and designed by his wife, Melissa.
It's maple syrup, yeast, and water.
Oh, it's very, very smooth. It's really different than anything I've ever tasted.
Now, before you at home start adding water and yeast to your maple syrup in your kitchen, just know
it's a labor and energy intensive process for sure.
Is it a more expensive source material than, say, rye?
Probably 10 times the cost. You know, I feel like we need to have a few of those things that maybe don't make financial sense, but they make, fun sense.
Now, if we were to measure life like a tree, you would see some burn marks on the rings of Hollerhorn.
This survived the fire.
Oh my God.
Tragedy struck a few years ago when an electrical fire from the kitchen consumed everything Carl and his family had built by hand.
Was there a period of time where you were really not sure if you were going to keep trying to do this?
100%. We lost a lot of family heirlooms, very personal things that we had here. It was too traumatic to be down here and look at just a pile of ash.
News of the fire spread throughout the town of Naples and the Finger Lakes region.
The community rallied behind us, and I think that is the thing that pulled us out of sort of our own self-misery.
Customers immediately swung into action to raise money for and rebuild the treasured local gathering place.
It's been an honor to be able to make things that people appreciate.
I get choked up because it's just more than a distillery, you know? It's a community space, and I think we need that.
In a fitting twist, what did survive the fire has now been marked by a phoenix, a symbol of rebirth for this tight-knit community. Who knows? If this tree spirits thing takes off, there may be a new maple harvest ritual to look forward to each year. Just probably not one you want to put on your pancakes.
My favorite distilleries are ones that represent that place. You taste the magic of that place, and that's what we're trying to do.
I'm Lee Cowan. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you right here next time on Here Comes the Sun.